Hi, so this is my presentation on Osiris and Pharaonic power and the possibility that Osiris acts as a construct to preserve belief in monarchy during times when the pharaoh is unable to perform their duty, as would be described as with their affiliation with Ra or other perfect ideals. So essentially, the concept is that faith in Osiris is faith in the pharaoh, is faith in Egypt. So just a brief overview. The image on the left here is of an Aberdeen symbol of Osiris. It's based on a relief from Ramses I's mortuary temple at Osiris, but it's described as a distinctly 19th dynasty elaboration of a fetish which stretches back to at least the Old Kingdom, if not prehistoric times. So we have this tradition of Osiris essentially being a very, very ancient god with a cult center at Osiris, or at Abydos. And Frankfurt actually posits that Osiris, as the dead king, was acknowledged and worshipped by those from the house of Menes, so the first unifier of Egypt, and that he wasn't just the god of the dead, but he was the mythological form of the dead ruler. And so essentially he could have existed culturally as a surrogate for the king, and therefore assumptive of a king's failings in that broader context. So before we can discuss the rise of the Osiris cult in the 5th dynasty, we have to talk about the immediately preceding religious convention, which was that of the solar religion and the identification of the pharaoh as opposed to just being with Horus, with Ra, and with this almost idealized, demanding form of rulership and the identity of the king, which I would argue sets up an unrealistic expectation. So for instance, if the king is supposed to be this incredible divine figure as the sun gives life to the earth and consequently to Egypt, and the lives of his subjects are not necessarily equivalent to this, it can create an unrealistic expectation, not just towards a given king, but to the institution of monarchy itself in that divine context. So right here we have in the right corner Khafre's Sphinx. So this is a full identification of the pharaoh with sun imagery and with the sun god. And above we have a later emergence of the similar imagery with Akhenaten being connected to this idealized form of divinity and divine monarchy in the form of the sun's disk and his receiving and the consequently transmission of that power. So the establishment of this religious tradition and approach and this justification for monarchy was established in the 4th dynasty, specifically with the sun gods, and they've continued into the 5th. However, in the 5th dynasty, things begin to change. So solar worship continues for most of the 5th dynasty. However, the temples are getting increasingly smaller and smaller until we get to, as Rohatyn brings up, the first depiction of Osiris, which actually comes from the pyramid complex of Djedkarayese, who was the first king of the 5th dynasty who did not actually build a sun temple. And with the inscriptions of Osiris and references of Osiris, this different idea emerges, where all of a sudden the king is no longer directly correlated or related to the sun and being the incarnation of Ra, but rather at some points, and mostly in his death, he becomes to be identified with Osiris, who is then considered, or is called in the instruction of Ptahhotep, who is the vizier of Djedkarayese, as the arbiter of Ma'at and the lord of Ma'at. And so we have this concept that the divine truth and the order and the expectation of Egyptians in their life and upon the pharaoh is actually vested within Osiris as an arbiter, and and Osiris is actually referred to as the Lord of Ma'at, which is a moniker which is also taken by pharaohs. So there begins to be this conflation of identity and this shifting of responsibility or sharing of responsibility towards this divine figure. Now, it's also important to note that the beginning of the 5th dynasty saw decentralizing reforms, which would lead to eventually, as Wilkinson argues, to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. So Userkef, he and his successors, they began to elevate the role of the pharaoh even further above the mortal plane and more to the divine plane. Consequently, they decentralized a lot of the administration, and all of a sudden there was more room for human error. There was a larger, there was a more complex bureaucracy, which would increase the chance that the divine ideal wouldn't necessarily be manifest. So the scholarly consensus regarding the rise of the Osiris cult is that the period of political instability, which fell at the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the first intermediate period, led to a democratization and therefore a access to elite regarding Osiris and invocation and integration with him. However, Mark Smith actually makes a very interesting argument, which is against this democratization due to political instability and consequent religious change, because he brings inscriptions from non-royal tombs of the 5th and 6th dynasty, which include invocations of Osiris, and he argues ritual integration with him in spells. So his argument is based on the premise that religious change is not linked to political change, and he attempts to evidence this with the fact that Osiris appears during times where he doesn't consider it to be a time of great political change, the middle of the 5th dynasty. However, as we talked about in the previous slide, Userkef's decentralizing reforms were initiated at the beginning of this period, and there was a building tension between pharaohs and the rising elite, which was firmly established by the time of Djedkare Ise, according to Wilkinson. So there's this political turmoil brewing, and I would argue a religious foresight, which would be necessary to deflect blame away from the divine monarchy as an institution, and also from the role of government officials as they were acting as instruments of this institution. And so it's actually in periods of turmoil, regime change, and political upheaval that the cult of Osiris grows. So in the first intermediate period in the Middle Kingdom, there are these amazing festivals which occur at Abydos, the processions of Osiris and the raising of the Djed pillar. And there's this projection onto Osiris as being the pharaoh of pharaohs, the one who will ultimately sustain Egypt. And who is given the power and is given the vessel to actually continue, to allow a pharaoh to continue on into the next life. So for instance, in the middle here, we have the opening of the mouth ritual, in which one of the texts and one of the spells which was said was, thou art pure, O Osiris, which is specifically referring to the pharaoh in transition from the role of Horus, the imperfect manifestation of the Osirisian ideal, back into Osiris itself. And by virtue of that reunification with Osiris, able to fulfill the Pharaonic duty of providing for the eternal Egypt, not only even if not in this world, at least in the next. So advancing quickly to the Amarna period, we kind of see this interesting occurrence of what happens when a king once again assumes that all-encompassing solar power and does not move the onus of taking care of Egypt onto Osiris and his manifestation through Horus. So we learned before that Osiris was referred to as the Lord of Ma'at, and pharaohs were referred to the lords of Ma'at. So Akhenaten on this relief to the right is actually seen enthroned next to Ma'at. He is now seen as the arbiter with no intermediary. And his obsession and self-obsession ends up with history remembering him as a heretic or a tyrant, with his model of kingship being promptly overthrown and then forgotten, or rather consciously erased. And interestingly, to the left, we have a stela of the king scribe Senu, who's in the aftermath of the Amarna period, where once again they're referred to as a bureaucrat and a transmitter of the king's will. They're referred to as Osiris, who is purified like Horus, and that their adversaries are beneath their feet and their enemies are overthrown as if they had never existed. But it's referring to Osiris, not the enemies of Egypt, not the enemies of this person, but the enemies of Osiris. So there's this conflation between the identity of bureaucratic and governmental power and this broader idealistic concept which can be referred to as the one who is truly in charge, not the individual in their actual life, but Osiris itself responsible for the proliferation from the next world. And so this text is extremely important because we see this evolution of the idea that the issues a person faces in their life is absolved upon their absorption into Osiris, which then serves to maintain faith in the status quo. So interesting as well is that Osiris is in charge of judgment. So if you are already going to be absorbed magically into Osiris through ritual, then what your misgivings and the things that happened in your life wasn't really your fault, or you wouldn't make it into his realm. So the representations of the assimilation into Osiris seem to imply, or at least enact, this assimilation before any judgment happens. So it's effectively an exoneration of the subject for material crimes in their life, and a deflection of that blame and absolution into Osiris in the next. And so the question is, if this is the function of the Osirisian theology, how can we be mindful of similar idealistic justifications for systemic failures today?